Hey guys, welcome back to Corey Has Spoken. So I was cruising around on the internet today trying to find something that I wanted to riff about, and I found a headline that kind of grabbed my attention, and it goes like this: Dana White on MMA boxing crossovers. We've already seen what happens. That's the headline. Dana White isn't sold on seeing any more MMA boxing crossovers. Many athletes in combat sports have crossed over to some other field. The world of MMA has seen MMA fighters attempt to cross over into boxing, only to come up short. And when it comes to boxers trying their hand at mixed martial arts, there is much room for improvement. Some prime examples of crossovers include undefeated boxing legend Floyd Mayweather versus UFC veteran Conor McGregor in 2017. Notably, McGregor fought well in 10 out of 12 rounds of the fight, but Mayweather pulled away and claimed the TKO victory. And Tyron Woodley, losing to Jake Paul twice, has likely yet to leave the minds of some hardcore fans. To compare, multi time boxing champion James Toney was eager to fight Randy Couture in MMA. He was determined to come out on top, but was finished via arm triangle choke in a minute and 30 of the first round. But the lack of success from crossovers has not stopped everyone from trying the challenge. For instance, UFC champions Kamaru Usman and Francis Ngannou both want a taste of boxing royalty. Usman continuously flirts with the idea of boxing renowned Canelo Alvarez, while Ngannou has his target set on the Gypsy King, Tyson Fury. Ngannou and Usman believe those fights will make history, but Dana White appears to be completely over the idea from his interview with ESPN MMA. We saw it. We saw what happens, said Dana White. We know what happens if a boxer comes into the UFC, and we know what happens when UFC fighters go to boxing. White has expressed a complete lack of interest in MMA boxing crossovers with anyone on his fight roster, especially if he feels the fight would not be as lucrative as the Mayweather versus McGregor bout. So let's unpack this a little bit because Dana White gets a lot of heat because UFC fighters pay is, much lower than boxers by example. And because of that, a lot of people tend to think that Dana White's just a money hungry guy. I'm not saying Dana White doesn't desire money or that he's not money hungry. I don't know him personally, but I will say that there is some proof in this article that there is something that is more important to Dana. We're going to unpack all that and see what that thing is. The Floyd Mayweather McGregor fight, that match made an ungodly amount of money based on the combatants alone. It was rumored that Floyd Mayweather made in excess of $300 million, while Conor McGregor, being the B side in that scenario, made $100 million. That's $400 million revenue just for the two guys that were in the boxing ring that night. So you can only imagine overall what kind of revenue that event must have done. But why was it a one off? Why don't they just do this all the time? I'm going to give you some reasons for that. So I have to use the Mayweather fight as an example so I can spin off of that and, let you know some details on why they don't just continuously do these. And one of those examples is Mayweather was 49-0. All right? Believe it or not, his status as the greatest of all time 49-0 boxer at that time really mattered as it relates to Conor McGregor coming into the boxing ring. In other words, even all of the professional boxers who did that for a living that faced him couldn't beat him. So, did anybody really expect Conor McGregor to beat him? Obviously, McGregor is a great fight promoter. So obviously, you have a certain set of the population who, just based on how well McGregor sold that fight and how confident he appeared, and the fact that he's just a little bit bigger than Mayweather, oh, he's going to knock him out. He's going to knock him out. He had an extensive knockout record in the UFC, and there was people for sure that actually believed that McGregor could win that fight. But the hardcore fan base, all the people who are hardcore boxing fans or hardcore MMA fans, most of them knew that It was a circus. It was just a show that there was no way that Conor McGregor was going to go into the boxing ring and beat an undefeated boxer in Floyd Mayweather when even professional boxers couldn't go in and beat him. And it was no skin off the back of the UFC or Dana, because if McGregor goes in there and even doesn't get knocked out in the first one, two, 3 rounds, that doesn't make the UFC look bad. Uh, Even boxers couldn't beat Mayweather. So, that's what I'm getting at. It's no skin off the back of the UFC in that scenario, because you had an undefeated boxer, and they stood to make so much money because of the huge star power of both of those athletes, that it was a one-off that Dana White was willing to consider. If this happens multiple times and these guys keep going into boxing, UFC fighters that is, keep going into boxing, especially prime ones who are currently fighting for the UFC, they go into boxing, they're getting beat, they're getting handled, they're getting picked apart in the boxing ring. Eventually, that breaks down the legitimacy of the UFC, and that makes the UFC fighters look bad. And there is one thing that supersedes or precedes the money aspect of it, and that is the reputation of the UFC, thus, the reputation of UFC's talent. And that is the one thing that is more important than the almighty dollar to Dana White, is to not hurt the reputation of the UFC. There's this saying that goes, if it makes dollars, it makes sense. In this case, it makes dollars, but it does not make sense. And I think it hurts his brand and it hurts his business in the long run. If they continuously let these guys who are under UFC contract go over and fight in boxing, that's not what they do for a living. That was one of the reasons that Mayweather has such an advantage over McGregor. His cardio. He's been in there a million times, and he knew when to extend himself, when not to, in terms of when to push his cardio, when to sit back and kind of relax and or let McGregor punch himself out. He knew when to do all of those things because he has so much experience with it. So, you know, 10 out of 10 times guys who are UFC fighters are going to go in there, they're going to lose, and then this is going to hurt the brand of the UFC. So there's one thing that is more important than the almighty dollar to Dana White, and that is the reputation of his company. Because if he hurts the reputation of his company by continuously letting his fighters do this and then they lose, well, that equates to what? Less dollars in the future. Dana White's a smart guy. He's a very, very smart guy. He wouldn't be in the position he's in now if he was not. It's not that Kamaru Usman and Canelo Alvarez would not make good money. I mean, of course, man. Of course, I'd pay $100 to see that fight, and I know a lot of avid fight fans that would pay a lot of money to see that fight. But Uncle Dana's just not going to let it happen because he realizes that what he does now is going to affect his brand later on down the road. So he's turning down that money for the prospect of having a longer, lucrative, successful run in MMA as the leader in MMA with the UFC. That doesn't stop guys from wanting to, get out of their contract somehow. Or, we've seen a lot here recently, like with the Ngannou situation, where they refuse to re-sign their contract. Nate Diaz is, looking to do that right now. He's not signed a new contract. He's wanting to go out and box. They're trying to get in there, make these big cash grabs, 3 million, 5 million, $8 million. Ngannou could probably, with the pay-per-view points and everything, which Tyson Fury was willing to give him, I mean, he's probably looking at 15 to 20 million on a fight with Tyson Fury. Do you know how many fights he would have to fight in the UFC to get $20 million? It's a no-brainer. So from the fighter's perspective, you completely understand why they want to do it. But from Dana's perspective, if you look at it from the business angle, you can completely understand why Dana does not want to continue to do that, and why the situation with Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor was a one-off. But unfortunately, even a one-off causes other fighters to look and say, well, he did it. He did it. Yeah, but everyone is not a McGregor, and everyone is not an undefeated Floyd Mayweather who nobody expects McGregor to beat. You understand what I mean? So that's what's bigger than the almighty dollar for Uncle Dana is the UFC's a reputation. Oh, and I want to say this too. It's not just UFC fighters going over into the boxing realm. Same thing when James Toney came over and fought Randy Couture. He lost in the first round. Clarissa Shields recently. She is a very good boxer, obviously, and a very good fight promoter. But it took her what to her second MMA fight before she had already lost. You can't go over into another sport with people who trained every day for months, for years. A lot of them, they've been doing it since they were children. And you can't put somebody on a 6 month training camp in boxing, send them over into a boxing ring, and expect them to beat someone who's been training religiously for 20 years. It just, it's not going to happen, guys. You can't expect to take Clarissa Shields, as good of a boxer as she is. You can't give her a 6 month MMA training camp, no matter how good the coaches are, no matter how quickly she picks up on the techniques. And you can't put her in an MMA match and expect her to win. She won the first one, which that was pretty impressive. But even in the first fight, you saw where her weaknesses were immediately. Her first opponent had lost more fights than she had actually won, sad to say. And so as soon as Clarissa Shields got into the cage with, someone who even had a winning record, that was it. She already has lost her first MMA fight. So it's not just MMA fighters going in and losing to boxers. It works vice versa. But it's just one of those things where you're seeing more of the MMA fighters wanting to go into boxing because the pay discrepancy is so huge. But there's reasons for that. And, Dana White's fighter pay structure and the company itself is just set up completely different than boxing. And they do a good job of spreading the money amongst all of the fighters. In a boxing fight, you might have the two headliners making, 10, 20 million apiece, but then the guys on the undercards, you know, making 30, 40,000 bucks to go in there and box. So it's very, very, very lopsided in the boxing realm, and it's not in the UFC. And it's kind of a bad comparison because a lot of people think, oh, Dana White doesn't want to pay his fighters. No, it's set up completely different. The hierarchy and the pay structure, it's just set up completely different than boxing is, and it's worked for them. It's worked for the company, and because of it, they have more fighters. They have more popular fighters, and it's one of the reasons that MMA has literally surpassed boxing as being the number one sport and the number one combat sport. So it is what it is. But anyway, guys, that's what I got. Thanks for watching, and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. I'll see you next time. Peace.